Today is the last Sunday in our series on our small group series on My One Word. I want to say, it's been really cool listening to and hearing about how this sermon series has been and how this small group series has been for so many of you. Each week at our staff meetings, we've had conversations about the words that we chose as staff members, and we go around and we'll share, and there are times where Pastor Craig will share some of the words that some of you guys have shared with us and given him permission to share, and we've had great responses from the small groups about how it's helping our groups grow in their relationships with each other and their relationships with their families and even with each other one individually as you guys share your words with others in the congregation. Now, one thing I've noticed is that in some of your conversations that I've had, I've noticed that you've chosen words, and a lot of you have really put some thought and some effort and some really been intentional about the words that you've picked, and it's been pretty apparent to you for others that right away you knew what your word was going to be. Even maybe in December when we started talking about this series, you already knew what your word was going to be. And you've had the last few weeks where you've been able to really take some of the things that we've talked about in the sermons and in your small groups, and if you've read the book, you've been able to pursue that, and that's going to help for you as you go about the rest of the year. And on the other side, there may be some of you who, your bracket started out with like all 64 words, and you've taken some time and you've maybe narrowed it down. You've got it down to 4. You've got it even down to 2, and you're just about ready to pick your word, and that's good too, because it means that you are being intentional. It means that there's something that matters to you about the word that you pick. That the other words that you've narrowed and wiped away, that you've said each time, these words are a little bit more important to me than those words. And hopefully maybe now as we get to the end of this series, that you're ready to solidify that word. In either case, the word that you have picked or that you will pick is a word that hopefully has meaning to you. And it represents maybe a big struggle or something that's going on in your life. And for many of you, this is something that you see as critical and something that you need to be focused on and working on this year. You've taken the questions that Craig mentioned last week. Who do I want to become? Who do I believe that God wants me to be? And as you've narrowed down and you've answered those questions, you've kind of gotten to that answer for the big question that if blank is my word, hopefully blank isn't your word, but if patience is my word or love is my word, is this the word that's going to do the most good for me this year? As a staff, Craig started asking us about our word back in 2000, or about what our word for 2014 was going to be back in December of last year. And he'd come around and he'd say, "What's your word going to be?" And I would say, "I don't know." And somebody would say, "Well, what do you think Chad's word should be?" And they'd say, "Well, we don't know yet." And then a few days later, he'd come back and he'd ask, and I'd be like, I thought you were kind of just joking. And I kind of started to realize that he was serious. And what I realized is I hadn't really thought about it. I hadn't had much focus on it. And there went my word. Focus. I need focus. And I'll be honest, like if you know me at all, that's a really fitting word. I oftentimes feel like the dog Doug from the movie Up. And as soon as somebody says squirrel, I'm off nowhere and somewhere else. It's sitting here on Sunday mornings, there's so much going on in this room. Oh, by the way, did you guys know that Sam Manthy's up for Mr. Millard West? Sam's our drummer. Hi, Sam. Okay. Oh, sorry. Let me get back to the sermon. Focus for me is a fitting word. I'll be sitting in the office and we don't have our own offices at the office. We've got desks and somebody will walk in and whatever, I'll forget what I was working on. And I really started thinking about this, and the more I thought about focus, the more I realized this is the right word for me. But then the implications of that word started to hit me. I started thinking if I'm going to choose this word, it can't be a word that I just think about getting things done when I'm in the office. If I'm going to choose focus as my word, then that means that beyond when I'm working in the office, it means that when I go home, I need to focus on my family and focus on spending time with my son and having pillow fights with Caleb. That's his new thing. And every day he wants to have a pillow fight. And I need to be, when I'm having a pillow fight, I need to be focused on that pillow fight. And when it's bedtime, I need to be focused, Kim will tell you, on helping get our kids to bed instead of watching the last couple minutes of the Huskers beating Ohio State, okay? I have to be focused. If I'm going to be more productive at work, though, then that's going to help. Because if I can get things done at work, then I don't have to bring work home. And so I can actually use that time at home instead of trying to get things done that I didn't get done at the office. This is the word that I needed. And the whole process really did take me about a month to get this, even to this point. And then I was listening to Craig's sermon last week, and I started to get scared. Because he said that our focus on our word can't just be when he preaches every Sunday morning about my word. I can focus for 35 or 45, how long are Craig's sermons these days? I can focus for a little while. But for 12 months? I mean, he reminded us next week we're starting a new series, and yet we have to carry on our word for the next 11 months. And he mentioned that the responsibility is mine now, that I have to make this something that I focus on, and I do. And for somebody who is good at focusing, they can pick a word and they can stay focused on it. But for ADHD Chad, who picks a word that says he needs focus, and the word is focus, how do you focus on focusing when your problem is focusing? Are you keeping with me on this? I'm lost myself. No. Maybe your word is focus. And you find yourself in the same boat as me. Or maybe your word is patience, and you're feeling that it's really easy to be focused on patience when every Sunday your pastor is talking about it and reminding it. But you've discovered and you're trying to figure out, like, how am I going to stay patient when I'm not being reminded of it every day? When we're not talking about it in my small group, and how am I going to be reminded of patience and get better at it when I still just can't stand, and I'm getting my kids and my wife and the dog and everything is just driving me nuts. My guess is, for most of us, the last 4 weeks, picking your word, choosing your word, and getting started on your word, that's the easy part. The next 11 months, the next 334 days are going to be the difficult ones. And it can be tempting to abandon your word and say, oh my gosh, it's so difficult, I got to just give up. Or to let it just slip away. And I want to challenge you, don't abandon your word, because even if you feel like you've made good progress at it, what could happen? Think about what could happen if you carry it out to the end of the year. And you might be right. Your word may already have made a difference in your life. And when it happens, it can be easy to say, sweet, I got this under control. I've been doing this for 3 months. I got it pretty good. Let's move on to the next word. But I want to caution you against that, because despite what progress you've already made, if you've only been at it for a month or 2 months, to be really honest, that's not enough time to let something really sink in to make a lasting impression. You see, the idea isn't that my word would become my word just for this year, but that by the end of this year, that my word becomes a part of who I am. And a month is not quite enough time to make that happen. It's much more likely that if you can focus on your word for a whole year, that you're going to be able to carry that on into 2015, into 2020, and on and on. You might be on the other side of things and finding that it's a struggle. Like, instead of maybe you got it figured out, maybe you pick patience and you get to March or April and you're realizing, I'm not any more patient now than I was 3 months ago. There's the temptation to think that maybe you picked the wrong word, especially if patience is your word, and you might be wondering, what's taking you so long, God? But here's the beauty of it. God doesn't work on our timing. He works on His. If God worked on our timing, Craig would have given one sermon at the beginning of January, and everybody would have their word, and everybody would be amazing at it already. Anybody got it totally figured out yet? I don't. That's why your word is your word for the entire year. it's not your word for 1 week or just a 4-week sermon series. It's not for the 4 weeks that your small group is meeting together. If July or August comes along and you're struggling or you think that you've mastered your word, ask God the next question. God, what else do you want to tell me about my word? Look for ways to apply it that you haven't seen yet, or maybe that God may not have brought into your path yet. Later on in the passage that Bailey read just a minute ago, in Proverbs 16, verse 26, it tells us we need to have an appetite for things. Stay at it. Keep working at it until you've milked your word for all that it's worth. You see, God placed this word on your heart and in your life for a reason. So stick to it. And we're reminded that when we do that, if we commit to something, that God will see our plans through in the way that He sees fit. So what do we need to do to make that happen? And I think we start with habits. You know, studies demonstrate that starting a new habit is a whole lot easier than quitting an old habit. Have you ever noticed that? People who try to quit smoking, it takes them years and years because all it takes is one more cigarette to start that habit back up again, even if they've quit 2 or 3 years before. But to get a new habit going, it doesn't take quite as long. And so if you are somebody who is trying to get rid of, a lot of people probably pick your word because you have an attitude or a habit in your life that you'd like to see changed. Well, what do you need to do to make that different? You know, maybe you're like me and you're trying to learn focus when you've been an on-the-whim kind of person most of your adult life. Maybe you pick patience, but your kids and your husband are driving you just up a wall and you keep hoping and waiting and expecting that they're going to change, and you're struggling to have a good attitude while you're waiting for God to do that. Maybe you pick kindness because you keep having people remind you that you aren't a very nice person sometimes. And so far, you've done a pretty good job of being kinder, but if this sermon series ends and the small group series ends and you have to keep going back to the job or the attitude or a group of people that are the ones that continually create that bad attitude in you, it's going to be really difficult to keep it going after just 1 month. Maybe you picked joy as your word this year and you were planning for a joyful year. Last year wasn't so great, but instead, guess what? This year just is not starting out as joyful as you had hoped. But you know, joy could still be the perfect word for you, because God could be using this as a year of difficulties to teach you that the strength of your joy comes from Him, not from your circumstances. Maybe you picked trust, only you haven't had a lot of reason to trust people lately. Changing that isn't going to be easy, because you've gotten into a habit that doesn't necessarily agree with you, and now you're trying, instead of starting something new, what you're actually trying to do is you're trying to stop a habit of not trusting people, and you're trying to let go of hurt or betrayal that you've experienced in the past because you so desperately want to trust again. None of these things happen overnight. But here's the good side of that. A new habit that replaces a bad habit or a bad attitude, a new attitude, is easier to make happen than just quitting the old. So if you're trying to break a bad habit, start working on something new. And while starting a habit requires some consistency up front, it's a lot easier to make happen. One thing that can make the old habit easier is if your word is patience, and you're not a very patient person, start your day by identifying those potential opportunities that are going to test your patience. For me, it's getting my kid out of bed and getting clothes on him. Okay? He doesn't do that. He does the leg kick, which takes an extra 10 minutes, okay? But if you know that that's coming, you can adjust your attitude and be prepared for that. If your word is focused, begin your day by identifying the distractions that may exist to draw you away from the things you need to do that day. Figure out how you can avoid or redirect those distractions. If your word is love, start looking for ways to show love, even if it's a day where you don't necessarily feel loving towards other people. One of my favorite movies is the Evan Almighty, and part of it is because I'm a Steve Carell fan. And thereand there's this scene where Morgan Freeman, who plays God, is talking to Evan Baxter's wife, and she's talking about how frustrated she is with her husband, who basically thinks he's Noah, and that God has asked him to build an ark in his backyard when he's supposed to be a newly elected member of Congress or the Senate. She's so frustrated, and she just can't seem to see where he's coming from, and she's at her wit's end, and she's about to give up. And God looks at her, and he says, "You know, it sounds like you have an opportunity." She kind of looks at him quizzically, and he says, "Let me ask you something. If somebody prays for patience, do you think that God just makes them patient, or does he give them the opportunity to be patient? If he prays for courage, does God give him courage, or does he give him opportunities to be courageous? If somebody prays that for their family to be closer, do you think God just zaps them with warm, fuzzy feelings? Or does he give them opportunities to love each other and grow closer?" You see, my guess is that God didn't give you the word that you've chosen just so that he could snap his fingers and make that word instantly work in your life. My guess is that God gave you that word so that over the course of this year, he is going to put opportunities and challenges in your life to see and live that out and work it out for yourselves. He's not going to just make your kids or your husband easier to deal with. He's not going to make your dog stop barking at the neighbors every time they walk by. But God is going to fill your world with opportunities to live out your word. I'd be willing to bet that every word is a word that is full of opportunity that you've picked. Every day there are going to be opportunities to put your word into practice. So seize those opportunities, because the more we practice the new habits and the more we try to place those new habits in place of the old ones, the easier it's going to get. And the great thing about starting that new habit, about seeking your opportunities and really sticking to them over a period of time, is that eventually the old habits are going to fall away and the new habits are going to replace them. I remember my pastor from years ago, and he often reminded our staff and our congregation that just because we want something to be different doesn't mean that it's going to make different. And just because I feel that I want this to happen doesn't mean that it's going to happen. He said, change requires action, even in the times that we don't feel it. If your word is patience, you're going to have to be patient even when you don't want to be. And what he said is this: it's easier to act our way into a new set of feelings than it is to feel our way into a new set of actions. And what he was getting at is this: if you really want change to happen in your life, if you really want that word that you've chosen this year to permeate into every aspect of your life, you need to work at it every day for a long time. It can't be something you focus on for the length of a sermon series and then assume that it's taken hold of you so you move on to the next thing. You need to keep at it even when the next things begin. 22 days. We're in the 4th week of this sermon series, and a book that has 12 chapters and a 4th sermon and 4 small group lessons. And then we're moving on to the next thing. But don't move on from your word, because likely a month in, you've probably only just scratched the surface of what that word means and what God wants to do in you through that word this year. So stick through it and allow it to impact you throughout the year. Seeing it through to December 31st, though, means that you are going to need the help and the support of those around you. You can't just take a few weeks of study and then forget about it. You have to have people that are going to support you and hold you accountable. And I want to invite you to look at your small groups and to look around at the people that you see on Sunday mornings every week, to look at people you've talked to about your word, and to say, will you help hold me accountable to this? Will you help me do this? There's a couple of ways that I think that works. One is simply just asking somebody. A lot of us, 70% of our church, Craig said last week, are in small groups. That means 70% of you already have people who are willing and most likely able to ask you how your word is going. What if at the beginning of your small group time every single week, you took the first 5 or 10 minutes and you just went around the room and you said, how are you doing with your word? What has God showed you with your word? You can still do Undaunted. You can still do whatever series we talk next, but you can stay focused on that word. And the cool thing about it is if you've got somebody holding you accountable, whether it's one person that you know is going to ask you those questions and you're going to go to breakfast every week and you're going to talk to each other or your small group, there's a lot higher likelihood that you're going to stay focused on that word because you know that somebody is going to check up on you, especially if they're doing it too. And the cool thing is this, if you've asked somebody to hold you accountable, or if you're thinking about it, there's two cool things about that. One, you've thought about who will actually ask you that question. And two, you're intentional about it. You see, I remember being in high school and we used to always talk about having accountability partners. It was a big thing when I was in youth group, and somebody that's going to talk to you, hey, did you read your Bible today? And I always picked somebody that I knew wasn't going to ask me those questions. Why? Because I didn't want to have to say no. But if I intentionally pick somebody that says, hey, did you spend some time thinking about your word today? Man, they're going to ask me, and I better have an answer. And it's going to be a really long year if every time they ask me, I say no. So work on it with somebody, whether it's your small group or whatever, because we are better at things when we do them together. How many people start out the year, every year, going to the gym saying, this is the year I'm going to get in shape. And they pay I'm going to do it, I'm going to pay for a year-long membership, and 2 months into it, they haven't been to the gym but 4 times in that first week, and it hurt, and so they never went back. Your word might hurt you too. It might cause those pains, but that's a good thing. So keep your words as a way to check in at the beginning and end of small group or with somebody that is going to hold you accountable. Find a way that is going to help make your word memorable. Craig talked last week about somebody who got a tattoo of their word. And especially if you put that backwards on your forehead, every single time you look in the mirror, you're going to be remembered of it. Or you get put it on a plaque and frame it and put it on your desk at work or somewhere that you walk by every day that when you look at it, you're going to remember that word. Or even better yet, if it's in a place that's prominent, probably not your forehead, I'm not actually suggesting that, but if it's on your desk, when somebody walks into your office, they're going to see that word. They might ask you, why do you have that word? What is that for? What does that mean? Why are you doing that? And you're going to have an opportunity to talk about it. The more you can bring your word into every aspect of your life, every part of your day, is the more prominent it's going to be, the more you're going to be reminded of it, and the more you think about it, the more that God is going to use it in your life. The last thing I think that's important is to realize that your word is going to kind of morph throughout the year. A lot of us, we pick a word that we think, oh man, okay, I'm picking this word focus because I need to focus on getting things done in the office every day and not feeling stressed at the end of the day that I didn't get anything done. Or I need to pick patience because I find I'm always yelling at my kids. And what happens is, though, as we work on that word, it begins to take on more meaning than just what we intended for it to be. Maybe you had some specific expectations for your word. But I want to ask you, what would happen if, as the year goes on, if you began to see the way that God chooses to use your word in your life, and it becomes different than what you initially expected? Are you going to be okay with that? Be prepared for that to happen, for your word to change and adapt. I'm not saying that you get a whole new word, but I'm saying that the word will take on new meaning. If your word is love and you said, I need to love my wife better, what happens when God begins to convict you that not only do you need to love your wife better, but you need to love your boss better and you need to love your neighbor better when they blow their leaves into your yard? Is your word wealth? Maybe you wanted to focus on financial security this year. What happens when you don't win the lottery or if you don't get that promotion that you've been hoping for that was going to come with that extra 20% raise that was going to help you to work on that financial security? What if God's plan, even though He put the word wealth on your mind, what if God's plan for wealth for you meant helping you to realize how wealthy you already are? Or to truly see what it means to be wealthy in our spiritual riches versus our financial ones. You see, as you focus on your word, and as the year goes on, I think your word will probably move from being just a goal that you have for yourself to becoming a lens through which you see the world. As you go about each day, and as your word begins to feel like it's becoming a part of you, you're going to start to ask yourself more than just, how do I be more patient with my family? How do I be more patient with God? You're going to start to say, what does it mean to be patient when it comes to this and when it comes to this? What does it mean to love when it comes to this and this? What does it mean to be joyful when a family member passes away? What does it mean to be joyful in the midst of my sorrow? And this is how the author of the book, Mike, puts it. He says, consider how your word might apply to your work life, your home life, your family life, your hobbies, your friendships, your dreams, your health, your finances, your reputation, and your faith. Have you thought about how that word's going to make a difference in all of those things? You're going to see that your word actually has application probably far beyond what you began the year thinking it does. Even probably areas that maybe you didn't yet want that word to apply. As your word becomes something you focus on, you are going to discover more and more that that word applies to your whole life and that God has designs for that. You see, in my case, I've already begun to see my word take on different meaning. It's not just about me being effective at what I do, but when something has come up to me, not just prioritizing and planning my day, but I've begun to avoid some of the distractions, and I've seen that happen. But I've also seen that when a new opportunity comes to me, or that I already have another priority, that now I have to ask myself, if I accept this priority or this new thing, is it something that's going to take my focus away from other things? Or is this even something that I can actually focus on without it suffering in other areas of my life? Is this the right thing for me to focus on? All of a sudden, these things become more and more important. So focusing on focus has helped me say no to a few things already this year so that I can stay focused on some of the other things that matter. Make sure your ideas for your word don't get in the way of God's ideas for your word. Your word will likely take on different meaning throughout the year. It might impact you in ways that you never expected or you weren't prepared for. God might have some ideas about your word that you never even imagined. And all of those can be very good things. Because at the end of the day, it really isn't about our agenda for the word. It's about allowing God to work in and through you and accomplish what He knows you need in a way that is going to be best for you and your walk with Him. Proverbs 16 verse 9 says, we make our plans, but it's the Lord who determines our steps. So be prepared. Because the scope and focus of your word can and likely will change somehow over the course of the year. But you need to stick with it for the whole year to see that happen. At the end of the day, I guarantee you will be pleasantly surprised at how God has used your word even beyond what you envisioned at the beginning of the year. We don't exactly know what God has in store for us as we begin this adventure, but that's the cool thing. Right now, we're just at the beginning. God put a word on your heart, and you took hold of that word, but the year is just beginning. So stick with it and allow God to determine the course that it takes until December 31st and for the rest of your life. So let's pray.